Unused content. A very straightforward term for sure, and one that ends up being a very exciting prospect for fans of any series. The range of unused content can vary pretty wildly, from a single line in the code to an almost completely functional portion within a game that is simply inaccessible through normal play. Regardless of the difference in scale, any aspect of a game that goes unused stirs up conversation on what could have been, and oftentimes, the less information on why something ended up unused, the more interesting it becomes. Touhou is no exception to this, and with so many games in existence, you can expect there to be at least something in terms of unused content. You might even be familiar with at least one instance of it. So with that said, let's take a look into some of the unused content present within Touhou Project. Well, first I have some things to say before actually beginning. Big surprise there, huh? To start, the main focus of this video is unused content, but I will be mentioning some things that may not exactly fit that definition. The second is I'm only going over the stuff I consider worth mentioning, but if you're interested in more than what I'm bringing up here, I'll be leaving sources in the description so you can take a look for yourself. That should be everything, so let's begin. Kicking off, we have Touhou, highly responsive to prayers. To start, I want to talk about something that is shared amongst 4 of the 5 PC98 games: unused music. Touhou 1 through 4 all have unused music tracks. Not an uncommon thing, but what's neat about these tracks is most of them are featured in Mystic Square's music room, complete with comments from Zun on why they went unused. There also exists 5 albums, known as Aku's Untouched Score, that are basically high-quality releases of the PC98 OSTs, with some bonus tracks, including the unused ones. Now I said most of them are featured, as there is one unused track that didn't make it into either Aku's or Mystic Square's track list. This song is from Highly Responsive to Prayers. It's called Shrine of the Wind. This track is included within Highly Responsive to Prayers' music room as the second track in the list, despite it not showing up anywhere in normal gameplay. Another thing to note is that the other unused tracks that were included in Mystic Square's music room were not included in the music rooms of the final versions of the respective games they were originally for. Highly Responsive to Prayers' music room is the only way to listen to Shrine of the Wind normally, but some emulators seem to play the track during the credits. Highly Responsive to Prayers has 20 stages normally. However, by using the game's debug menu, it's possible to load into any stage you want, including stages past 20. Most of these stages are broken messes. However, stages 21 to 24 seem to be actual unused stages. Unused stages play Shrine of the Wind for some reason, and completing any of them results in a hard lock, forcing a reset. The last thing I want to mention about the game is tied to a section within the code. There is a list of variables referring to the game's 4 difficulties. However, alongside them, there's variables for extra and count that are both never used and have nothing to them. I have no idea what count means, but extra implies a possibility that an extra stage was planned at some point in development. Now, this is purely speculation on my part, but maybe stages 21 to 24 are related to this, as normally there's a route divergence at stage 5, but there only seems to be one set of these unused stages. Of course, it's more likely that these are just scrap stages, but part of the fun of this kind of thing is that speculation. Now we jump all the way to Touhou Gensokyo, Lotus Land Story. Now it's time to take a look at trial versions. The trial versions music room lists a few of the unused tracks for the game. They're not selectable, but they do have comments from Zun that differ from the ones given for the Mystic Square music room. Here's a translation of them. These tracks were removed in the final version, and for whatever reason, the comment on the Stage 5 theme, Lotus Love, was changed as well. Here's the trial comment, and here's the final comment. Now for the Windows era, starting with none other than Touhou Komakyo, the embodiment of Scarlet Devil. I'd like to begin with something that applies to almost every Touhou game going forward: the full unlock code. In early Windows era, Touhou 6 through 9, going to a specific spot in the menu and inputting a code will unlock everything in the game. You can tell the code worked if you hear the game's 1-up sound. From Mountain of Faith onwards, the unlock codes start being beer-themed. Fitting, given Zun's love of the stuff. Even with these codes dating all the way back to EoSD in 2002, they were only discovered and documented in 2021. Crazy how something like this could go unnoticed for nearly 2 decades. Now for EoSD itself. I want to start with some of the pre-release stuff. On the game's official website, there are a handful of promotional images shown off. The main one I want to show off is an early version of the main menu. Reimu is still sitting in all her glory, but the background and filter are noticeably different. It reminds me of Pyrography, personally. Back to the website. There's actually a larger amount of images on the website that went unused that have been documented. One of which is an even earlier version of the main menu. And as you can see, it's vastly different. No Reimu. Instead, there's only a view of what is presumably the Scarlet Devil Mansion through a window. On to the game. First, I want to talk about the unused difficulty variants. Patchouli, the Stage 4 boss, has 5 different spell cards that combine 2 elements. On easy mode, she only uses the first one on her last health bar. Which one she starts with is based on your chosen shot type. However, because there's only 4 shot types in the game, one of the spell cards, Mercury Poison, goes unused. A single easy spell card is small, so how about a whole stage? In EoSD, easy mode locks the player out of stage 6. But in earlier versions of the game, you can access the stage through a glitch in practice mode. The stage itself is what you'd expect. It's an easier version of Stage 6. But the interesting part is that it even exists at all. See, Lotus Land Story had the same easy mode restriction put on it, however there is no easy Stage 6 in the game at all. Mystic Square removed all those restrictions on easy mode, then EoSD brought them back. An unused stage, an unused spell card, all that's missing here is the unused character. That's right, EoSD is home to a rare instance in Touhou of a character going unused. And you might even be familiar with them, as they're probably the most well-known piece of unused content in the series' history. I am of course talking about none other than her, the unused Stage 1 Midboss, who kinda looks like Rumia, speculated to simply be an older design. The image is very small, so I asked a few artist friends if they could draw their interpretations, for a better look at her. Okay, the real famous character isn't her. It's a character known only in name as Satsuki Rin. That's not an exaggeration. This character only exists as a name in the code. The only thing known for sure is that she was planned to be a third playable character that was cut due to time constraints. There was an instance of an unknown girl on an EoST circle cut that was theorized to be Rin. Zun was asked if this girl was intended to appear in EoSD, to which he said no. There's no mention of it being Rin by name, and the girl in question is known nowadays as the Team Shanghai Alice poster girl. But pretty much every fan interpretation of Rin's design stems from this poster regardless. It's pretty wild how something as small as a name in the code could end up this well known. Maybe it's just due to her rather unique instance of being an unused character in Touhou. Looking back at EoSD from now, imagine how different things could have been had Rin made the cut. A whole other playable character debuting in Touhou's most recognizable game might have shaped a lot of things differently over the course of the entire series. On to Touhou Yoyomu, Perfect Cherry Blossom. And much like Lotus Land Story, there's some trial version differences. A big one is the character art, mostly regarding the playable characters. The trial version art stops at the waist, and some of their expressions are a bit more, expressive. The final version's changed all the art, complete with full body. However, a trace of the old art still exists in the final version's character select screen, as Reimu is still wearing the gloves she had in the trial version. There were also a handful of gameplay differences in the earlier demos. Mechanics-wise, the cherry point system would simply act as a screen clear and item magnet upon hitting the required 50,000. Extra lives were tied to score, and on-screen bullets didn't despawn when a boss showed up. For the characters, Reimu B had more needles, and Sakuya B had less knives. The game's soundtrack is also quite different. This is mostly apparent in the Stage 2 and 3 themes. They have a much lower pitch than the final versions. Also worth mentioning is Stage 1 and Chen's theme originally had different names. Stage 1 was False Winter, Pseudo Winter, and Chen's theme was Little Quadruped. On the topic of names, Yuko actually had different given names at some point in development. She started as Ayaka, then became Yuyuka, until finally settling on Yuyuko. Along with her, Ron and Yukari had a different family name, Suzukaze, for only a single version. To wrap this up, there's another instance of an unused pattern in the game, belonging to the Prism Rivers. It's a non that incorporates all three of them at the same time. A neat idea, but I guess Zun wanted the nons to be solo performances and limit the group show to spell cards. Now, Touhou Eiya Show, Imperishable Night. There's an unused graphic telling the player they've unlocked the Phantasm stage, except this is just a leftover from PCB. Leftover assets happen a lot, and is usually the simplest explanation for why something is within the game, but nowhere to be found. In this instance, it's definitely a leftover, but there was a point where it would have applied. In some of the earliest versions of IN, there exist graphics showing a potential Phantasm stage early on. Some of these were removed in later versions, and in the final, the Phantasm text is replaced with Last Word. In another instance of pure speculation, perhaps early on there was no concept of a final A or B, and instead there was just Eren at stage 6. Kaguya would be the extra boss, and Moko would end up at the end of Phantasm. Speaking of Moko, there's a part in her theme's MIDI file that is located after where the song loops, so it never actually plays in-game. Here's what it sounds like. Apparently, Alice had something similar to her theme in PCB, except instead of 15 seconds of piano, it's 12 minutes of drums. That's about everything in the game, but there's a bit more unused stuff that is only known from Zun's own words. Strange Creators of Outer World, a Touhou magazine that features all kinds of Touhou-related things, including interviews and lookbacks on games throughout the series' history, complete with comments from Zun. In the cross-review section of Imperishable Night on Stage 4, Zun states, "Having the main characters show up as rivals is standard. I did it in the third game even. I actually wanted to have 4 different bosses, but a lack of time forced me down to 2. I could have done something like with Patchouli, but I would have had to make additional music and artwork as well. Had I been able to implement everything as planned, then the Scarlet team would likely have fought Yomu, and the Netherworld team would likely have fought Sakuya." Imperishable Night is already filled to the brim with content, so it's understandable that not everything Zun had in mind came to fruition. But it still would have been cool to have a Phantasm stage, as well as 2 additional bosses, complete with new music. Here we are at Touhou Fujinroku, Mountain of Faith. The most interesting changes stem from the earliest version of this one. For starters, Graze is missing. Let me explain. In Mountain of Faith, Graze doesn't do anything at all, but you do get the sound effect and small sparks when grazing. But in the trial version I mentioned, even that is missing, effectively making Graze non-existent. Considering how even in the final version Graze does nothing, it's a wonder why the effects were added. Maybe it just felt odd with the missing, but it doesn't change the fact that grazing is literally pointless. Next is regarding the difficulties. Seems that early on, Mountain of Faith's easy mode was only planned on being 5 stages long. Why it was changed isn't known, but my guess is it was due to Mountain of Faith being a reboot of sorts for the series, similar to how EoSD was, but not nearly as large. The final version of Mountain of Faith easy mode gives a bad end regardless of a 1cc, which is a trait only shared among the main entries with Lotus Land Story and EoSD, 2 games with 5-stage easy modes. There are a few unused spellcard variants, belonging to Nitori and Kaneko. Nitori's Extending Arm card has a Lunatic variant that adds an additional set of slower lasers. Kaneko's is interesting, as in her case, the unused variants belong to the 3rd spell card on normal mode. Mizayama Hunting Shrine Ritual is replaced on higher difficulties, but the pattern has both an unused hard and Lunatic version. What you're seeing now is the Lunatic one. Personal opinion, Extending Arm Lunatic looks awful, and I would have preferred if Kaneko's 3rd spell didn't change to what it is in the final. Now, a small stop at Tokanjuden, Subterranean Animism. Well, this isn't unused content, but I thought it would be neat to show. In the earliest trial version, the bottom left corner isn't solid. so you can just go through it and leave the playfield, effectively becoming invincible. Again, not unused content, but if I pretend this is just the prototype of Yukari's special ability, I can get away with it. It's a similar story for Touhou Seidensen, Undefined Fantastic Object. There's not a lot there, mostly trial differences, and even then some of them seem unintended. One that caught my attention though was the life count. Once again only present in the earliest trial version, the number of life pieces needed to obtain an extra life was 3, but mid-bosses didn't drop life pieces when taken down. Not counting the Nue Ball, there's only 4 mid-bosses in the final version, so I'd rather have the life system of the trial version for the full game, personally. Next is Touhou Hisoten, Scarlet Weather Rhapsody. That's right, I'm finally talking about a spin-off game. Unsurprisingly, there's a handful of unused and unfinished animations for a few characters. But that's not what I'm here to talk about. First, there's a couple of unused cards. Alice and Marisa both have unused skill cards, while Rayson has an unused spell card, as well as a duplicate card. These cards only exist as images within the game's files, and while Marisa's card does have art, the other cards are numbered in the place of an image. Next is on character palettes. SWR has 2 colors per character, however there are 9 unused palettes. What's interesting is that of these 9 unused colors, 2 of them belong to Rayson. Maybe multiple color options were planned at some point. Not all of these colors ended up completely unused though, as Sakuya, Patchouli, Yuyuko, and Yukari's outfits are all used in Hisotensoku. It's likely that they just made use of what they already made up, but excluding Rayson, I don't know why the other palettes were passed up. There's one more thing here that is related to the game as a whole. When Scarlet Weather Rhapsody was announced, it was referred to as the 9.8th installment in the series. It was later changed to 10.5, and the reason for the change remains secret. Spin-off games are labeled as either 0.3, 0.5, or 0.8 installments, so this isn't too strange. But this is the only instance where it has been changed, and the secrecy around it as to why just makes you all the more curious for what ultimately doesn't change much. That leads us to Touhou Hisotensoku, best known as SWR's Character Expansion Pack. Hisotensoku adds 5 new characters to the game, those being Suako, Utsuo, Sanae, Meiling, and Chirno. Although Meiling technically isn't new. According to an interview Zun did with Nai Radio, Meiling was planned for SWR, but was cut due to time constraints. Zun also states that her inclusion in Immaterial and Missing Power was all Twilight Frontier's idea. Later on, Zun talks about the characters who were included in Hisotensoku, and how originally he wanted to theme it around weaker characters with a boss. The initial lineup was Kaguya, Chirno, Wriggle, Rumia, and Nitori. In the same interview, he states that his original lineup seemed to cause a decline in the team's motivation. In a different interview for Strange Creators, Zun mentions that he had trouble imagining the type of attacks they'd use. Unabara Iruka, Twilight Frontier's representative, was also part of this interview, and mentions the group's desire for Hisotensoku was to add popular characters and bosses. They were particularly interested in adding Moko. In the end, Chirno was the only character to survive the initial draft. However, Nitori and Moko would eventually find themselves in the fighting games later on. It's a shame for the fans of the cut characters here, but the final roster is still great. Although I do think it would have been hilarious to watch Rumia smack someone as powerful as Yukari with a lariat. Now back to the main games with Touhou Kishinjo, double dealing character. Well, not quite. Seems the further I go, the bigger the bug list gets, but the unused stuff shrinks. A lot of the games I've gone over so far have had instances of unused sprites, but they're mostly tiny details. In DDC and ISC, Wakasaki Hime has some unused sprites that are noticeably different. They look like she's underwater. If she went underwater, that could mean something like invulnerability periods, such as a timeout spell. But given she's a stage 1 boss, any attack that limits the chances to deal damage, or a timeout spell, would have been a bad decision. Now for Tokanjuden, Legacy of Lunatic Kingdom. Remember what I said about growing bug lists? Well, this trial version here has quite a number of them that I won't be going over. I recommend you take a look for yourself afterwards though. First, the life system. In the earliest version, Legacy Mode rewarded extra lives through score. In the next trial version, life pieces were implemented, and 5 were required for an extra life, instead of 3. There are some stage sections and boss attacks that saw a bit of rework as well. In Stage 2, there's a section with fireballs that shoot revenge bullets. The amount fired at you was greater in the trial. In Stage 3, there's a section that only fires revenge bullets, but in the trial version, they'll fire regardless. Another one on stage 3 is the descending zigzag fairies. The blonde ones fire once they appear, but in the trial version, they shoot an additional shot close to the bottom of the screen. The most well-known change is with Dorami's first and second nods. The bullet density was reduced in the final version. This was acknowledged by Zun in the Strange Creators interview on the game, stating that if the pace kept up like that, then the game would have ended up being terrible. Speaking of that interview, it mentions how Sagume doesn't have any damaged art. Zun responds saying that he had made art for it, but didn't use it due to the length of the after-battle dialogue, and a bit because Sagume was only testing the player. Unused portraits aren't uncommon. There's a number of them I've skipped over since they were just kinda there. But in Sagume's case, there's a given reason as to why it went unused, so I figured it was worth mentioning. There's actually another instance of an unused non here, belonging to Junko. Don't know the best way to describe this one, but given it's a Junko pattern, it's not anything too crazy, aesthetics-wise. Junko has another instance of an unused pattern, but it's a bit strange. In the extra stage, Junko uses a spell card that is aimed at you. It's basically a streaming section. Thing is, this spell card has additional properties where after a certain amount of bullets, Junko will move. And after every 3 movements, she'll fire a random spiral of red. The spell card never gets past the first set of aimed shots though, so the rest of it is completely unused. What you're watching is an attempt at restoring the spell card back to what I mentioned, and as you can see, it makes the spell card as a whole a lot more engaging. Next is Touhou Hioibana, Antinomy of Common Flowers. There are a few things within older versions. June in particular has a number of unfinished sprites within the game's files. Dorami, on the other hand, has finished, yet unused sprites that depict her in green stockings, pink gloves, and slightly modified color palette. These were all removed in later versions, and there's not much outside of them. But once again, an interview in Strange Creators shed some light on some more of the things left on the cutting room floor. Well, actually, in Jun's case, it's more on what was used. Originally, the plan for Jun was to be a solo boss, and a manifestation of the incident would end up pairing up with her. Zun ended up wanting her paired up with another person instead, and under the condition that she would be more of an extra than a standalone character, Shion was born. Speaking of characters, Zun later mentions in the same interview that Dorami was originally chosen to be in the game because he wanted a character from Legacy of Lunatic Kingdom, and she was the only one who would fit. Seems that Clown Piece was considered at one point as well, but was scrapped early. It's pretty amazing how a popular character like Shion came into existence simply because Zun wanted a partner for Jun. It's also pretty amazing how Dorami's inclusion boiled down to none of the other characters from LoL-K fitting, yet the Dream World ended up becoming a large aspect of the game, and an interesting place in Touhou lore as a whole. Just goes to show how much of an impact something can have, regardless of how small an addition it seemed to be. Here we are at Touhou Tenkusho, Hidden Star in 4 Seasons. The only thing I have to show off here is a screenshot from Zun's blog of an early version, where you can see a life piece counter under the life bar. I'll be looking at Strange Creators again for this one, as there were a few different ideas for the structure of the game. The first idea was to have a 5th season unlocked after clearing the main game once. Then you were required to finish the game again with the new season to reach the true end. Another idea was to require the player to clear with the other 4 seasons to unlock the 5th one. These ideas were scrapped as Zun considered them tedious, and ultimately a pain. The 5th season was used for the extra stage, but Zun had at one point considered combining the other 4 seasons instead, and decided against it as it was messy and not as fun. The interview concludes with a comment on a potential ending for the extra stage that there was no time for. Quite a difference to the final game, but it does make you wonder what it would look like had Zun gone through with any of these ideas. It's probably for the best that he didn't, but considering how the story flow would have changed as well, there was a possibility of a whole new extra boss instead of a rematch with Okina. Now for Heufu Nightmare Diary, Violet Detector. Well, this is a quick mention, courtesy of Strange Creators. One of the earlier ideas for the game was to have Sumireko record short, TikTok-like videos when you level up enough. No, I did not make that up. This idea was scrapped simply due to time constraints. Another dropped idea was a death cancel mechanic that functioned like a death bomb in the main games. Basically, hitting the right button with 100% charge when getting hit results in a life-saving selfie. There's also mention of a stage that would require the use of this mechanic to complete, but the system was scrapped as a whole because Zun didn't want the mechanic to be so essential to playing the game. This article isn't translated. Not many people seem to care for this game in general, but I was able to get this info with the help of a translator I know. Violet Detector left a few things out that likely would have made the game better. I'm curious about the video recording aspect, and would like to see Zun try it for a new game. Just without Sumireko. Now for Touhou Kikkeiju, Wily Beast and Weakest Creature. I want to open with another instance of a changed name in the series. Ebisu Eika, the stage 1 boss, had a different given name in the demo, Yoka. There's no explanation as to why it was changed, and given Ebisu's overall popularity, I doubt many people even noticed or cared. Wabak's token gimmick is similar to UFOs in the way that they bounce around the screen. This is the only real similarity to UFO in the final game. However, in the demo, the amount of power you lost upon getting hit worked the same. If you don't know how much that is, it's 1 whole power, and you're given 7/100ths of it back. The last thing I'd like to mention is an unused UI sprite in the game, called Regeki, that translates to Spirit Burst. This looks to be an option for button mapping, which means it's possible that at some point in development, Zun considered the ability to manually activate or release Roaring Mode. Speaking of unused UI stuff, there's actually something from Unconnected Marketeers that I'd like to mention here as well, since I'm afraid I don't have much to share on that one alone. There's an unused UI sprite in the game that translates to Disposable Card. Disposable could imply limited uses. It might mean there were some cards planned that were scrapped. But I think it's more likely that it means that some of the cards in the final game simply weren't infinite use. And that's everything. Well, not everything, but a lot of different things throughout Touhou games that went unused. There was actually a lot more than I was expecting. And while I only went over the things I thought would be interesting for this video, it doesn't mean what I left out isn't, or wouldn't be, interesting to someone else. Aside from Zun's interviews, all the stuff I shared here was discovered and documented by various people. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I'll be including all the sources I used in the description, and I highly recommend you take a look for yourself. But fair warning, not all the games are equal in cut content, although I'm sure you realize that with how much jumping around I did. Of course, it's possible there's more to find within these games, and there's still plenty of new ones to come. I'm glad I was able to put some of Touhou's most intriguing what-ifs under a spotlight, and I hope you found it as interesting as I do. I truly wonder how different some games would be had some of what I listed here ended up being used. In some cases, it's probably for the best that they weren't. But imagine a world where Rin Satsuki was real. Oh well, I guess she can hang out with the rest of the unused characters, better known as the PC98 roster. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you during the next incident.